Welcome to the International Sunday School broadcast. Each week, we share God's Word with you by teaching the weekly Sunday School lesson. The broadcast is sponsored and produced by Reverend Clay Evans and the members of the Broadcast Ministers Alliance of Chicago. Please join our host, Reverend Dr. Jeanette Wilson, as she shares this week's lesson.
Welcome to the International Sunday School broadcast. Today we have a special for you this Sunday. We did not want to leave and close this year out without really lifting our sights and lifting our view of Christian education. And so you who are watching us on television or watching us on YouTube, we want you to know that we have one of the greatest African American scholars, biblical scholars in the country with us today. I'm not going to introduce him because there's a young man who knows him so much better than I do, but the young man that's going to introduce him, I've known him, I don't know how long, because I don't want to be that old. But anyway, his father is my mentor, Dr. Otis Moss Jr. And Dr. Otis Moss III is one of the leading preachers in America. They are calling for him all around the country. And so I asked him if he would come and help us start this first conversation with a biblical scholar, and sometimes it'll be a conversation with the elder. Oftentimes we'll have people like Reverend Clay Evans and Dr. Jeremiah Wright and Dr. Otis Moss. We want you to see and hear from people who understand the Word of God but also know how to apply it. And so today I asked Dr. Moss, I said, would you come to our little conversation that we're holding at Cosmopolitan Community Church with Dr. Marvin McMickle? And he said, sure. So then a week later he says to me, want to talk about that conversation? I said, yeah. He said, what did you plan? I said, well, I plan for you to engage in a conversation. He said, well, that's interesting because he ordained me. I didn't know that. So then when I talked to Dr. Marvin McMickle, who is perhaps the humblest scholar I know. I mean, he's got some credentials, and most people with all the credentials he has, they respond through people. So I sent him a little email and asked him would he come to Chicago, and he said yes. Then I found out he grew up in the church where we are holding this conversation, Cosmopolitan Community Church, which at that time was headed by an African American woman who happened to be African Methodist Episcopal. And they invited her to take over leadership of Cosmopolitan Community Church. And under Dr. Mary G. Evans, this church grew to be the largest mega community church in the history of the community churches across the country, headed by an African American woman who traveled and preached across the world at a time when women in ministry were not really that recognized. So today in the audience that you will see, we have African Methodist Episcopal pastors, we have United Church of Christ pastors, and most of all, we have the Baptist pastors. And then we have apostolic preachers as well. So we're ecumenical, and I want you to listen to my friend who I've grown up watching. He's younger than I am, but I've grown up watching him. The pastor of the Trinity United Church of Christ, the Reverend Dr. Otis Moss III.
Thank you so much. I'm elated and delighted to be here for this conversation. One of the great sages, public intellectuals, biblical scholars, and homiletics in our country, Dr. Marvin McMickle, as already mentioned. Dr. McMickle was born here in Chicago, grew up here at Cosmopolitan, was a graduate of Aurora University, went on to Union Theological Seminary, and worked at the Abyssinia Baptist Church in Harlem and pastored at the St. Paul Baptist Church in Montclair, and then eventually had an amazing pastorate in Cleveland. That's where I came in contact with this gentleman who had a great influence on my life at the Antioch Baptist Church. And when I was ordained, there was a powerful message about Moses that Dr. McMickle gave to 5 of us, and it still resonates with me today. He's currently the president of the Colgate Rochester Seminary, and he is doing a tremendous job, but also is a tremendous author. And I want to mention at the front of the conversation the books that you need to pick up, whether on Amazon or Barnes & Nobles or if you need to just download it on your Kindle or your iPad. There are several books that he has published. We have a portion of them from Judson Press. African American Christian Heritage, an encyclopedia, tremendous resource that everyone should have, and Preaching to the Black Middle Class. For those of you who have a bourgeois church, this will be certainly definitely a great piece for you to have. And he has put together a wonderful book, Caring Pastors, Caring People, Equipping Your Church for Pastoral Care. And the latest edition is Pulpit and Politics, Separation of Church and State in the Black Church. Now, there are several publications that are not listed here. One that I would strongly suggest that every seminarian pick up, Living Waters. That is a piece on exegetical preaching, and expository preaching. And what I think has become a classic is Where Have All the Prophets Gone? If you want to understand about prophetic ministry, Dr. McMickle has pretty much written the perennial guide in reference to prophetic preaching, what it is, what we're called to do, and given an incredible history of that. So I'm honored to have this opportunity to have this conversation with Dr. McMickle. Dr. McMickle, we welcome you to Chicago. Welcome back home.
Thank you. It's good to be home. Home in many senses.
Absolutely.
Home in the city and home in this church.
Could you share with us, since you grew up here at Cosmopolitan, Dr. Mary Evans was your pastor. What was that like for you?
Well, since she was the only pastor I knew, hers was the only voice I heard. Powerful preacher. I think she had a master's degree from the U of Chicago, and 2 or 3 honorary doctorates as well. Wore her hair back in kind of a bow back here, and she always wore the kind of lace gown that I sometimes associate, with women today who are sort of pulpit appropriate garb. But when I began to hear other men tell me that God doesn't call women to preach, and that women cannot preach, and all of this sort of thing, all I could do was remember Mary G. Evans, who could out-preach any of the men who were talking about this. Pastored a great church. It was about 800 at that time, and that was between 1948 and 1956. We then left this neighborhood to go to 77th and Cottage Grove, and my family went to another location. But I had the warmest of affections for this church, for Pastor Hardy, who succeeded her, and also for Mary G. Evans. Her story is in the wonderful book, Daughters of Thunder, by Betty Collier Thomas.
Yes.
So those who want to learn more about her can find her within that collection of preaching women that she put together.
Now, you did a PhD in theater and history, I believe, at Case Western. What was the connection for you for theater, history, and theology?
I did, my dissertation was the film study of the black preacher. So in order to do a film study, you had to have some sense of the language and the concepts of the performing arts. So the theater piece was a way to get into the history of drama, on-stage presentation, the ways in which lines are delivered, so forth and so on. And then the history component was the basis upon which I would then go back and try to look at the black preacher during the time of silent films. And then the black preacher during the time when white racism limited the roles in which blacks could be cast. And then look at the films that were produced during the civil rights era. And then look at the films that were produced by black film directors and producers to find out whether or not that character fared any better from 1924, when the very first film featured Paul Robeson in a film called Body and Soul, to 1997, which is when I had to stop the study, which was Soul Food. And the reality, the sad reality is that the presentation of the black preacher has never moved beyond the sphere of caricature. So if you think about Soul Food,
Yes.
which is in other respects a powerful kind of commentary on black life and family life. But who is the first voice you hear? It is this preacher sitting at the dinner table, saying a prayer, talking about all of the breasts around the table, women, and all the legs under the table. So he begins as a caricature, sort of a comic figure. Then the family goes into a series of crises. Big Mama, the sort of the maternal figure, gets sick. The pastor never goes to see her. He's never cast that way. The family begins to unravel. Nobody invites the pastor, who is important enough to be at their table every Sunday, but is never brought in to help resolve these family crises. Big Mama dies. There's no funeral. There's no voice of comfort from the pastor. But when the film ends, guess who's back at the table? So what does that film, produced by a black producer in 1997, what does that film tell us about that person's perception of the role of the clergy? It's the old clownish, chicken-eating, word-splitting caricature of 1924.
So what would you say is the state of black preaching today and the black pastor? What are, you have 4 models in your book, your latest book about this priestly model.
Right.
You have the prophetic model,
Right.
you have the nationalistic model, and then you have the hybrid model that you have. So what is the state of black preaching? Where does it fall? And where does this black pastor, not just preaching, but pastor?
Sure. Well, as I argued in Where Have All the Prophets Gone, there has been sort of a flood of people into the priestly mode. There's no shortage of folks who want to be the priest, who want to work in the church, through the church, for the church, minister to the needs of their congregation, maybe dabble a little bit on the edges in denominational life, but by and large not feel any sense of personal or corporate accountability towards the issues that are going on just outside of the doors of their own church, much less within the wider social, cultural, and political sphere of the country. So my frustration with so many clergy is that they are so congregationally focused and so community absent that you could be right across the street, could be a major crisis. But if you don't belong to my congregation, if you aren't a member of my church, I don't feel any sense of ownership. So I often use Luke 16, verses 19 and following as a paradigm for this problem. Luke 16 is a story about Dives and Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus. And it casts these two characters. There is this rich person who eats sumptuously every day. He's dressed in purple, sign of wealth, and fine linen. Well, purple is enough, but then the fine linen just says he had money to burn. And he lived in a kind of an estate setting. At his gate, not his door, at his gates, doors, and then there's interesting use of the language, who would have eaten his crumbs. It didn't say he ate, it didn't say he would eat. It said if the rich man had offered him the crumbs, he would have eaten them. Meaning that the rich man didn't even offer him the crumbs, which he would have eaten. Okay, they both die. Lazarus dies and goes to Abraham. He's in heaven. The rich man dies and wakes up in heaven. The theological question is, why in the world is the rich man in hell? And the answer cannot be because he's rich, because Abraham was rich. And Lazarus is with Abraham in heaven. So why is the rich man in hell? And the answer is because he didn't pay attention to the poor man just outside his door. My takeaway from that is that hell may well be crowded with preachers. And their members. And they'll ask themselves, why am I here? And the answer will be, you didn't pay attention to what I put right outside your door.
So who would fall into, historically, I'm not going to make it modern, not historically, historically, who would fall into the categories of priestly, of prophetic,
Yeah.
of nationalistic,
Yeah.
For those listening?
Sure. Well, Peter Paris is sort of the creator of this terminology in black religious leaders, and he offers archetypes for each of these. So for him, J.H. Jackson was sort of the prototypical figure for the priestly role, a pastor and a denominational activist, but not much in the way of civil rights activism.
And for just a little bit, for those listening who may not be familiar with J.H. Jackson.
J.H. Jackson
yes.
was here in Chicago the pastor of the Olivet Baptist Church on 31st, at that time, South Park Avenue. I'll come back to that. And he was from 1952 to 1980 president of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. Having succeeded L.K. Williams, who had been the president of the convention before him. So if you think about one church basically running the National Baptist Convention for a stretch of about 60 years, you get a sense both of him and of Olivet at that time. He was also very much connected with the Richard J. Daley political machine, so that to the extent that he had any external influence, it was as Daley used him from time to time to sort of, be his hands and feet and eyes in the black community. In 1966, when I was here, Martin Luther King Jr. came to Chicago to lead an open housing demonstration in which I was involved as a teenager, marching into neighborhoods in Chicago that were rigidly and violently segregated. Rigidly. Why are you here? Violently. You better get your out of here. How bad was it? When I was about 16, there was a fellow who belonged to our church who worked for one of the steel mills in Cicero. You could come into Cicero if you worked there. Just leave in a hurry. Don't linger. So he was at a red light. He was going home. He was not breaking any of the rules. He was going home. He was a pipe smoker. Now this was before they had, inside trunk releases. If you wanted to get into your trunk, you had to get out of your car, go around to the back, open it up, take out what you wanted, close it, and get back in. At a red light, he did this. He was going to get some pipe tobacco. He was also a softball player. So both his tobacco and his bats were in the trunk. And somebody thought that he was lingering a little too long getting his tobacco. And they walked up on him and asked him what he was doing there. And he said, well, I'm getting some tobacco. He said, niggas don't smoke in Cicero. Took the bats out of his trunk and beat him to death. And there was never a prosecution. There was report from them, but they were kind of like
There's no grand jury.
These
yeah.
indictments.
Yes,
Yeah,
there's no indictment.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. We know what happened.
Right.
But so that was Chicago. King came to challenge that. Jackson urged as many preachers in Chicago at that time as he could influence to not get involved in the 1966 Civil Rights Movement. Fast forward 2 years. Dr. King is now dead. Jesse Jackson, who had come to Chicago by that time, takes a proposal to the city council to change the name of South Parkway to MLK Drive, which would have put J.H. Jackson's church at 3100 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. He could not tolerate the association of his church and that name. So he went to his friend, Richard Daley, and had the address of his church officially changed from 3100 Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard to 400 or something East 31st Street, because he didn't have any association with the name of Martin King. So Chicago was what it was, but Jackson was who he was. So he was the priestly character. Dr. King would have been for Peter Paris, the prophetic character, understandably so. He named Malcolm X as sort of the quintessential nationalist figure. One could have taken Marcus Garvey, one could have taken Elijah Muhammad, one could have taken subsequently Louis Farrakhan, but in the middle of all of that was Malcolm X. And then the political figure for Peter Paris was, of course, Adam Clayton Powell, at whose church I had the joy of working for 4 years, though not under him, under Sam Proctor, from 1972 to 1976. So there are lots of folks prepared to be priests. It's safe. It's rewarding. It's familiar. And lots of company. I don't encourage anybody to be a nationalist. I think that's a very difficult road to walk, to say we want to have a nation within a nation. You know, that's okay, that's your option. But that's tough to do. But the other two, the prophetic, don't volunteer for that. If the Lord calls you to it, go. But if the Lord hadn't called you to that, I don't mean by that you preach a sermon once a year from an Old Testament book. I mean that you have taken on the attitude of almost perpetual dissatisfaction with the state of your community, the state of your country, and the state of the world, so much so that you do become like Jeremiah. You wish you didn't have to speak, but you must. It's just in you. If you don't have that, then a yearly sermon on an Old Testament prophet is not what we're talking about. We're talking about somebody who is the ongoing, constant nuisance of a society that wishes he would just go away. Now, prophets don't live long. And those who live long often don't live comfortably. I don't mean house and car. I mean late night phone calls and death threats and Jeremiah Wright stuff. You know, sort of taking your words and twisting them all around. Don't volunteer for that. But if you get called to it, go. And then the fourth one is this political piece, which is the book that has most recently come out, which is to suggest that unbeknownst to many African-American clergy and their members, black preachers have been in politics since the Reconstruction.
Right.
But because of from about 1880 until its restoration with the Voting Rights Act of 1965, most of us never knew that because voting was so much out of our vocabulary. But there's a glorious history of black people in politics, and I'm trying to resurrect that as a concept and as a category, and to get preachers much more engaged in the political sphere and not just the safety and comfort and coziness of pastoral life.
Now it seems that all of the framing that you gave, there's more of a hybridization with people who are not just priestly, but they fall into prophetic, they fall into political sometimes, and they have a tinge of nationalism every once in a while, depending upon what the calendar may say.
Oh, well, sure. Yeah. National pride.
National pride.
Ethnic pride.
What would historically, what would you say are those who fall into a variety of those models of people who've demonstrated falling into those particular categories at one point or another?
You know, what's fascinating is that those that we most associate with being prophetic were almost all pastors.
Okay. Now they need you to pull up your mic a little bit.
Oh, okay.
Yes, so they can hear you.
People, while I'm not sure that everything in the book by Tavis Smiley is brand new. You know, the death of the king. His focus on the fact that on every Sunday possible, Martin Luther King Jr. was going back to Atlanta to preach at Ebenezer. It may have been overlooked by some people who thought that, you know, he's out there giving speeches and leading rallies, but they've never really thought of him as the co-pastor of that church, where your dad, by the way, was also co-pastor. So there was in him a pastor's heart for that congregation, as there was for the Dexter congregation, but the demands of his prophetic ministry were such that he couldn't follow through with the hospital calls and the weddings and the funerals and the pastoral counseling. But you go down the line of all the folks working around him, and most of them came out of the pastoral ministry and remained there even after their time with him ended. Your father is a perfect example, as are you, by the way, of people who have found a way to have a prophet's zeal and a prophet's urgency and a prophet's sense of I cannot be constrained, with a willingness to hold that in check long enough to also say, comfort ye my people, and to bring a tender word to a needy congregation. So there are, and always have been, people who are not prophets as a vocation, but they have this prophetic impulse, which is to say, there comes a time when the word of God must be declared with a certain boldness and a certain liberty, and come what may, whatever the consequences are. Now, I will tell you this, Reinhold Niebuhr, in his book, his Notebook of a Tame Cynic, said there's a reason why most of the prophets were itinerant from week to week. It's because nobody could hear that every week. I said to pastors, you don't have to do this every week. But if you can't do this after this week, if you can let Ferguson come and Eric Gardner be choked to death on television, and your first impulse is to preach a sermon on stewardship, then we can be pretty sure you don't have this impulse. So come and see somebody who can help you to find it, because you're just in the way. We need people after these sort of national cataclysmic moments to call us back to reality, to the 1960s comment. If you're not outraged, you aren't paying attention. Why aren't you outraged? Well, you know, God is good. Yes. We should be in prayer. Yes, we should. Somebody once drew a distinction between two great Greek orators, Demosthenes and Cicero. When Cicero preached, they said, my, what a speaker. When Demosthenes spoke, they said, let's go march on the king. We need a little more of that.
Now, what would you say, as president of a seminary, you have students coming in and out all the time, two parts. What would you say to a new generation of people going into ministry, number one? And number two, what are you witnessing in terms of not only interest or changes or culture in reference to ministry? Okay,
well, there's a wonderful book by a man named John Bottoms, Bottums, on the decline of the Protestant world. His thesis is that for 150 years, the United States was essentially governed by a Protestant ethic. Not a Max Weber ethic, but a Protestant kind of, we are the main line, the mainstream. Our values predominate. And that it was during that time when many of the Protestant denominations were at their height. Methodists, American Baptists, Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, Presbyterians, UCC. In the last 30 years, there has been a dramatic decline, almost to the point of demise, of that Protestant majority. Not that another church has arisen to take its place, but that the notion of having to belong to any denomination, or even belong to any church at all, has itself lost any sense of urgency. So that the fastest growing sector of American society would be these nuns, N-O-N-E-S. So I would say to young people who are coming into the ministry today, first of all, I'm glad you're here because it's a declining number. And two, you're going to have to learn how to work from the minority. because your voice will no longer be the voice of the majority in American society.
Well, we have to break right
Okay.
now. But again, we thank you for watching right now. We'll be right back after this break. Well, we're back once again, and again we are here with Dr. Marvin McMickle having a conversation about prophetic ministry, having a conversation about the state of ministry and the state of the black church. And so we thank you for joining us once again. Dr. McMickle, you were talking about the current state of ministry. You see so many seminarian students who come through Colgate, and you were talking about some of the challenges that we're facing, the decline of the mainline Protestant denominations.
Right.
But you worked with someone who was ecumenical, who was seen in academic circles as a great sage, and within religious circles, that being Dr. Samuel DeWitt Proctor. If you could share with those who are listening the experience of working with Dr. Proctor and what he brought to the table.
Yeah. Well, for those who don't know him, and by the way, there is a wonderful book that has just recently come out by a professor from the Proctor School of Theology in Richmond, Virginia, Adam Bond, entitled The Imposing Preacher, in the sense of presence. Picture of Dr. Proctor on the cover with his academic hood holding forth. Sam Proctor, a native of Norfolk, Virginia, ended up getting his PhD from Boston University about 1952 or 3, at the same time that Martin King was coming in, Dr. Proctor was going out, and they both went to Crozer. So that, in a sense, a lot of the sort of reflective, theological depth that one finds in Martin King is to a very great degree attributable to three of the major influences in Dr. King's life. We all know about the Benjamin Mays influence and to some degree the Howard Thurman influence, but not many folks knew about the Samuel Proctor influence on Dr. King. He was the president of two black colleges, Virginia Union and then North Carolina A&T. He was the college president when Jesse Jackson was the student body president. And it was his job of A&T students why their children were being arrested in these sit-ins that Jesse was leading. He did a fine job of encouraging both the academic work of the students, but not in any way constraining them in their attempt to give voice to their frustrations with those sit-ins in Greensboro in 1960 and 1961. I came to know him when he became the pastor of Abyssinian Baptist Church in New York after Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Now, one could well ask the question, who could possibly follow Adam Clayton Powell Sr. and then Adam Clayton Powell Jr., which is a stretch from 1908 to 1972. It was just Powell for all those years. Sam Proctor preached Adam's eulogy and won the church that day. And they called him the next month to be the pastor. He only came part-time because he had a professor's chair at Rutgers in New Jersey, where he was the Martin King Professor of Education. He said, I'll take half my salary and give the other half to hire some young associates to work with me. And William Epps was already there, so he stayed.
And William Epps is currently in California.
Second Baptist. He was there. He was the only one of us who had worked under Adam Powell. Calvin Butts was the second one that was hired. Calvin was beginning his first year at Union at the time. And then Calvin came to recruit me to go there, and I became the third one. Epps left in 74 to go to Detroit. No, he went to Winston-Salem first, and then Detroit, and then Los Angeles. I stayed from 72 to 76. And I learned more from Sam Proctor than from the entire faculty of union in terms of pastoral ministry. Now, I learned a lot about exegesis and church history and theology at the seminary. They could never have equipped me to pastor an African-American church the way that 4 years at Abyssinian in New York City in 1972 could have done. And I will tell you the most memorable thing I ever heard Sam Proctor say. He said to us in the staff meeting, I want you to remember that every Sunday, when you or I get up to preach, there's somebody coming to give Jesus one last chance before they go 22 blocks down the street to Muhammad's Temple number 7, where Louis Farrakhan held forth at 3 o'clock. So they would come to hear one more time. I'm going to give you all one more chance to let this make sense in this world. But if I don't hear it, I got an alternative. You have no idea what it was like to have Louis Farrakhan waiting for your crowd. Because he would almost repeat what. Now I know what they told you this morning at 11, and I'm going to tell you why it's wrong. And he would dissect that thing. So what Dr. Proctor really helped us to do was to understand about preaching in our own time and place. But one more thing he said to me: you cannot be a pastor if you don't make hospital calls. I thought that was a strange thing. And by the way, one of his peers, Cardinal Taylor, said the exact same thing. Said you don't become the pastor in the pulpit. You become the pastor in the hospital. They may well forget your sermon, but they will never forget that you came to see them in the hospital. So here's a story for you. This is an Eric Gardner Staten Island story. Because of the scope of Abyssinian, we had members in all 5 boroughs and New Jersey and Connecticut, and we were expected to make hospital calls wherever they were. So one day, Samuel Proctor, Calvin Butts, William Epps, and myself got in the car to go to Staten Island. We caught the Staten Island ferry, ate lunch, going past the Statue of Liberty, to go to visit one person in Staten Island. We're walking down the hall of the hospital, and we're coming into the door just in time to hear this woman lamenting to someone, oh, nobody from that church will come way out here to see me, she was saying, when the entire pastoral staff walked in. Now, that didn't just get her attention. That got the attention of all the folk that she just said she would never get a visit from. And all the hospital staff. You mean the whole ministry team came to see this one person? Yeah. So he would make sure that everybody in the hospital was visited by him. Samuel Proctor, 44 honorary doctorates. Samuel Proctor. Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of Education, Rutgers University, former president of 2 black colleges, head of the Peace Corps in Nigeria, author of 8 books, Samuel Proctor, went to see every single person in his congregation that was in the hospital and told us, if you don't do that, you're not a pastor. So you can't just preach at folks, you got to go visit them. You got to go see them. So I've always valued the importance of hospital calls. I've always valued going to the cemetery. Now, in some big towns, maybe you can't, because it's just so far away. But I never left the family at the church. I said, y'all go on, get buried, come back, we have dinner together. I want them to see me across that casket. When they're crying about that casket and who's in it, I want a ministry of presence to kick in where they can lift up their eye from that casket and see their pastor and have all that the sight of a pastor embodies in terms of the teaching of Scripture and the presence of the believing community and the hope in the life everlasting. And if you need a shoulder to cry on, they're gone, but I'm not. And that is how, over 34 years of being a pastor, in 34 years, I never had all these fights that some guys describe, and all of this division in the congregation. No, I didn't have any of that. He said, when did the honeymoon end? I said, the honeymoon never ended with me. We stayed in love because we stayed together in the hospital. We stayed together when they went to jail. When their sons were crazy, we stayed together in the mortuary. We stayed together. So I learned all that. That was not a part of the union curriculum. So if I just went to union and then went to work, I probably would have lasted 4 years. I went to union and then went to SAM. And those 4 years were as instructive as anything. Now, I'll tell you something else. The idea of getting a PhD was birthed by that King-Proctor connection. So, I was called, I'm going to reveal a little of my background. I was called to the ministry in this city in 1964. I'm 65 years old now. So in 1964, I went to summer camp. Now, I was not a great Christian in 1964, but I belonged to a church, not this one. And they were the finest women in Chicago were in that church. And they were going to go to camp. I said, well, listen, if that's where they're going, I feel a call to camp. I feel a call to go to camp. So I went to camp for a week, some camp out in the suburbs. And I cannot tell you anything about the evening campfires and the little devotional sermons. I wasn't paying attention to that. I was looking across the campfire, Sue and Barbara, and, hooking up for afterwards. But on Friday night, and the camp would end Saturday morning. It was a week-long camp. Pastor said, now, this is the night of consecration. If you would like to consecrate your life to be a good Christian and just live out the values of Jesus, I want you to take a white candle over this table, way over here. Take it to your cabin, put it under your pillow, pray about it, and then pack it up and take it home. Now remember, you promised that you were going to be a good Christian. On the other hand, he said, if you would like to commit yourself to Christian ministry, pastor, chaplaincy, missionary, over there is a table with pink candles. And I want you to go over there and take a pink candle, pray about it, go home and tell your pastor that maybe you've been called to ministry and let him or her cultivate you. Now, Dr. Moss, I know beyond the shadow of a doubt, because I didn't go to camp for that I took a white candle. I walked over there to get a white candle. I put a white candle under my pillow. I didn't pray about it. I wasn't thinking about it. I forgot I had one. Next morning, I'm packing up, sleeping bag rolled up, my pillow, and there's a pink candle. Now, my first instinct was to look around the cabin and see, who was looking at me, who, to say, oh, we got you, but nobody was paying me any attention. On the bus ride home, at least an hour long, nobody said anything to me. I told this story to my pastor. Well, don't you know, he said, Marvin has been called to the ministry. I said, wait, no, what? And nobody who was there intervened. That was 1964. That was 50 years ago. I have no other way to account for that transformation except that it was a miracle. So I keep a pink candle on my desk and have for all of these years to remind me of that moment. But, as I was saying, the Reverend Wilson coming here this afternoon while I had a call, I didn't have a clarity. I knew that God wanted something, but I didn't know what to do with it, so I just didn't do anything. To that 1966, when Martin King came to this city. I was working at a printing shop, Poole Brothers Print Shop, which I might add, by the way, was the sole publisher of Playboy magazine. Now, you're talking about a young boy in heaven. I just finished high school. I'm working for Playboy, and all we made was Playboy. I mean, Playboy magazine. So I would, I would say to my friends, "Oh, I know something you don't know." Okay. I was on break, sitting in the lunchroom, and I read in the Chicago Sun-Times that Dr. King was coming to Liberty Baptist Church that weekend to start this open housing campaign. Well, gosh, how many times does history walk up on you? You don't have to go to Birmingham. You don't have to go. Just go to 47th and South Parkway. And I did. And I stayed involved all summer. And the call found clarity with his understanding of what ministry should look like, which was the activist component. Then I went to Union and I ran into James Cone, who was just doing the black theology piece. And the call found further clarity in terms of a liberationist motif. And then, in 1972, Samuel Proctor, and this great, what he called the appreciation for the life of the mind. Well, if you say, what does a person look like who was mentored and molded by Martin King, James Cone, and Samuel Proctor? And the answer is me. They look like me. They can't help but look like me. It isn't much different for your father, by the way. So kind of the same overlaps. You are the composition of the hands and minds and models that God put in front of you and said to you, go for it. But if you want to know what it is, that's it. And what God never put in front of me was anybody foolish. So I was never distracted by anything I had to unlearn. A whole lot of foolishness. Mary G. Evans was as solid and as earnest and as straightforward as you could ever imagine. And then, my life just took that straight line. So I think my own impulses for a certain degree of social activism, a certain focus on the African-American experience, and a certain deep, deep commitment, not just to preaching, but to pastoral care. It just comes naturally as a result of these hands, that have been working on the clay. Then my first year at Union, I wanted to get involved in civil rights, naturally. So I said, well, where are the, who's doing what here? And discovered that Operation Breadbasket had an affiliate in Brooklyn under William Augustus Jones Jr. So off I go to Brooklyn. And I'm going there on the day that Breadbasket was getting ready to sit in at Robert Hall Clothing Store, which was a big clothing store chain here in Chicago at the time. But their headquarters was in New York City. Marvin, deep Marvin, you feel like going to jail? That's his first words to me. Do you feel like going to jail today? I said, are you going? He said, I'm going. I said, well, yeah, I'll go to jail with you. And we sat in the lobby of Robert Taylor Clothing Store headquarters. Stayed past the closing time, got arrested, went to jail. And his brother Lewis, who was the attorney, came and got us out. And so, here's another hand. As a matter of fact, I wasn't always a Baptist. I was here first, and then we joined the Disciples of Christ Church, Park Manor, 73rd and St. Lawrence. So I was that when I went to New York. But Bill Jones so impressed me that I ended up joining the Baptist church. And Bill insisted that I be rebaptized. I said, well, I've been baptized. He said, but not immersed. I said, no, I was immersed as a member of the Disciples of Christ. Ah, he said, but not in Baptist water. So he said, you must be baptized by a Baptist preacher in Baptist water in the Baptist church. So I was baptized. It's a good thing because the first time around it didn't take. So I needed a refresher course.
That is just an amazing just story of how you've been shaped and developed in your ministry. And what we want to do, we want to shift gears a little bit.
Yeah.
We have some people who are here who I know would love to raise some questions for you. And I say questions, not sermons. That they will definitely raise some questions. So we have an audience that is with us today, and a wonderful cadre of brothers and sisters who probably have some questions for Dr. McMickle. This is on recording, so I can't tell you to tweet your questions, but we are going to be hooking that up very soon. And if there is anyone that would like to ask a question, we would ask that you would do that at this time, and I know that Dr. McMickle will have an absolutely brilliant answer for you.
That's a question. One, this has just been absolutely wonderful. I really appreciate you sharing with us, Dr. My question for those of us who are 45 this age, what do we do today? Much of what you spoke about, you talked about those are in many cases a couple of generations away. Today, with young people, ages from 25 to 45, what do we do today to keep our moving forward, standing up for Christ and
It all depends on to whom you choose to listen. There are a lot of voices. This is part of my answer to your earlier question about what are the challenges that younger preachers face. Their challenges are in large measure under whose influence will they allow themselves to be shaped. And to the extent that they fall under the influence of someone whose theology and polity and ecclesiology is largely prosperity and health and wealth and praise and worship, and period. We should all praise the Lord. Yes, we should. God wants us to be, healthy and happy. Maybe there's a strong biblical argument against that, but again, my good fortune. Maybe that's why I am where I am. I was an emperor around something. I never had to unlearn that. Pick carefully who you choose to really hear. Now, I don't mean hear with the ear. I mean Shema, Hebrew hear. S-H-E-M-A. Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Shema, S-H-E-M-A, does not mean hear. It means hear. A whole lot of things may get into my ear, but never get to my heart. I've got a filter. This blocks that out. There are some people I would travel 100 miles to hear. There are some folk I would not cross the street to hear. If you ever discover that a truly great preacher is within 100 miles of you, go. If they're going to be at a conference or a workshop, go. Because it is by the first hand hearing that this sort of stuff gets transferred. I remember going to a 7 last words. I want you to brace yourself. A 7 last words service in Brooklyn, New York. Where the first word was Sandy Ray. The second word was Bob Laws. The third word was Bill Jones. The fourth word was Gardner Taylor. The fifth word was Sam Proctor. The sixth word was Y.T. Walker. And I was dead by the seventh word, so I don't. I was laid out on the street. I said, I can't take it anymore.
Wow.
And they were not trying to out-preach one another. They had so much respect for each other that nobody was trying to out-hoop the other, but none of them really hooped. Well, Bill, big, heavy voice, but he wasn't, It was amazing. Just 7 giants sharing the mountaintop. Here's another story for you. I'm hoping I'll get to your answer. When I was at Union Seminary in New York City, one Sunday night, 4 of us decided to go to Concord Baptist Church because that's where Gardner Taylor was. The joy of being in New York was you had access to all these people. Now, this was a church that had a lot of domestic workers who couldn't have communion at 11 o'clock. They'd have a 6 o'clock communion service so they could all come. So we all went up the subway, went from Manhattan to Brooklyn. We did not sign a guest book. We did not give anybody our name. We were not wearing visitor name tags, nothing. Just sitting in this, listen, the place is 40 rows long. And we're in the balcony, way in the back. And he says, before he preaches, the Holy Spirit has revealed to me that there are some seminarians here. And I want them, whoever you are, to come to my office after service. Well, we said this could not possibly be us because we didn't tell anybody, including the Holy Spirit, that we were going. We just consulted among ourselves. But we said, we better go because we just better go. And if it wasn't us, then we'll just leave. He said, are you the 4 fellows from Union? What did I do wrong? What did I do? Yes, I'm from. He said, come in. And he talked to us, small talk. He said, are you hungry? They don't serve meals at Union on Sunday. So we're starving, but So he reached into he carried his wallet in his breast pocket. He took out 4 $10 bills. And he gave each of us $10 and told us where to go in Brooklyn. He would call ahead to maximize that $10. Okay, that was nice, but here's the message. He said to us, all 4 of us, I don't want you to ever try to come back here to repay me. What I want you to do, he said, is when you are finally in a position, I want you to pass this $10 on to someone else in need. And don't forget to do it. I have passed that $10 on so many times. I wish I hadn't gone to Concord that night. That was the most expensive $10 I ever received, but it was a lesson. Why am I sitting in this chair at 65, living in Rochester, coming to Chicago? Pass on whatever I've got while I can still think straight. I knew a fella, you would know, I'll call his name, but I won't, who told me that he was going to write a book because Alzheimer's ran in his family, and he wanted to be sure to get this out before it was too late. But Alzheimer's got him first. And so I want to do what I can while I can, because I'm 65. Surely. Thank you. Again, from the beginning, we were talking about historic models for black preachers. And the first point in the book is that there have been 4 models out of which black clergy have been operating from before the Reconstruction, but certainly in terms of black preachers since the Reconstruction. The priestly model, pastors, the prophetic model, sort of, the troublers of Israel, the nationalist model, those who've given up on the possibility of integration and have chosen to pursue a separatist strategy, and the political model. That from the time of the Reconstruction, 1870, as soon as black people got the right to vote, they started voting for themselves. And because of white racism at that time, there were not enough leaders in other professions which were always available to white society. Doctors, teachers, business persons, military leaders. White folks never had to look to their preachers to be their political leaders because they could pick from any other vocation. From whom else would black folk have looked for leadership in 1870, if not among the clergy? So they filled that role and would have continued to do so, I argue, unless the post-Reconstruction hadn't come in and the stripping away of voting rights, which resulted in 2 things. One, the loss of black office holders and the loss of the black vote itself. I'm trying to urge that we reclaim that 4th category by arguing that it's a part of our history. Here's an interesting story for you. For you AMEs, this will warm your hearts. All AMEs know Hiram Revels, or should. He was an AME elder in the 1860s, a recruiter for all black regiments in the Union Army. If you ever seen the movie Glory, where did all of those soldiers come from to get to that place? They were all recruited by different people. One of the recruiters was Hiram Revels. After the war, he was appointed to the state legislature in Mississippi. In 1868, when the U.S. Senate was still populated not by open election, but by legislative appointment, they had to fill the vacancy in the U.S. Senate after Jefferson Davis resigned to become the president of the Confederate States of America. Mississippi came back into the Union. They had to have 2 U.S. senators. Who do you think succeeded Jefferson Davis as a U.S. senator from Mississippi? Hiram Revels. And by 1875, there were at least 150 clergy holding state, county, city, and federal political offices. Out of the 2,000 or so black people holding political office. Now do think about that. 2,000 black folks holding office in the government in 1875. It would take us almost 85 years to get back to that number because of the taking away of the voting rights. So I'm trying to urge people to do this and to never let themselves be dissuaded by the notion that a clergy person in politics is a violation of the principle of the separation of church and state, which is what I was told when I would run for office. Oh, you can't run because that's against the Constitution. Well, first of all, that phrase isn't in the Constitution. There's no such thing in the Constitution as the separation of church and state. There's a First Amendment. Congress shall pass no law regarding the practice of religion or the free exercise thereof, which just means that the government ought not run religions like a state religion in Europe in the 17th century. So don't let anybody talk you out of this because you think it's against the law. It is not. Don't not do it because you think that preachers have never done it. They have. But you got to have something more than that. You got to have a philosophy. So I took two very different theologians, Robert McAfee Brown and Carl F.H. Henry. One a decided liberal and one a decided conservative. Where Robert McAfee Brown from Stanford argued, politics can be a means of grace. Because politicians with values can, in a single vote, affect changes that a whole society would otherwise have to labor to achieve. That's Brown. And then Carl Henry says people of faith ought to be as active in politics as they can, both in their awareness of issues and even up to their willingness to run for and hold public office. So I'm urging that black preachers be political in the best sense of the word. Understand the political issues of their time. Do all they can within the framework of the law to support those persons who are seeking political office. You can't endorse a name, but you can host a forum where the issues can be aired out. And if the opportunity comes, you could run for office. Now, you say, oh, no, preachers can't be in politics. But I just told you that I was an Abyssinian. Gosh. From 1942 until he left, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. was a member of the U.S. Congress and the chairman of the House Education and Labor Committee, which holds the record for the most bills passed by a single committee in the history of the U.S. Congress, and yet you tell me preachers cannot be in politics. Therefore, you're telling me that Floyd Flake was wrong, and Bill Gray was wrong, and Walter Fauntroy was wrong. No, they weren't. They were following the same pattern. You're telling me that Jesse Jackson was wrong for pursuing it, and that Al Sharpton was wrong for pursuing it? No, they weren't. They were following the same pattern. And now you've got Emmanuel Cleaver, who is a retired Methodist pastor from Kansas City, St. Paul Methodist Church in Kansas City, who is a member of the U.S. Congress and a member in good standing of the Methodist district in which he resides. We need, well, we have enough priests. The line for the priests is long. Change lines. There's some vacancies over here. Somebody could be on the school board. Stop complaining. Get on the school board. Here's my only problem with Ferguson. It's not a Michael Brown problem. It is a 70% black town,
Right.
and a 10% black police force. That's because the police commissioners white, mayor is white, city council is white. They could vote those rascals out in the next election. But their voter turnout is 20%. Everything that happened in Ferguson could have been avoided by voting first. So if you don't vote and you leave other folks to do it, they will vote their best interests. They will put in place folk who do what they think is the best thing to do. Sooner or later, that will catch up with you. May I give you one statistic? I don't think that the election of President Obama was the most definitive election in American history, but it was a significant issue. I think that 1968 was, in many respects, was my first election. The most important election in American history, for this reason. Hubert Humphrey was running against Richard Nixon. The conservative grip on this country had not yet taken root. Johnson tried to do that, Goldwater tried to do that against Johnson in 1964. And President Johnson took 46 of 48 states. There was no conservative grip on this country. In 1968, there was no incumbent president. And Nixon ran, and he told you what he would do if he won. And he ran against Hubert Humphrey. It's an old-style Midwestern liberal. Humphrey lost to Nixon by less than 1 million votes in an election with 3 to 5 million black voters who were so mad at white folk that they chose not to vote. I'm mad at white folks. I'm not power. Burn it down. Not voting. And by staying at home in 1968, they gave the election to Richard Nixon, who then gave it to Gerald Ford, who then passed it on to Ronald Reagan, who then gave it to George Bush I, who then gave it to George Bush II, and they try to find somebody to give it to.
Now, we're going to have to wrap up really soon. He has a plane he has to catch, and it's going to hit rush hour real soon. But two things, if you could do for us. One, if you could tell us a book that you think all of us need to read. And number two, a preacher that we all need to hear.
Beside you.
No.
The book is by Martin Kilson. It is a very recent book. Martin Kilson is the retired professor of government at Harvard, African-American scholar. And it's called, I think it's The Transition of the Black Intelligentsia. Somebody can do the Google for me on Martin Kilson, the Black Intelligentsia. The first word, for some reason, has just escaped me. Anyway, his argument is that the historic struggle between W.E.B. Du Bois and a model of sort of leadership among black people to lift the masses and to bring a certain level of equality to the whole community through the use of political as well as educational interventions is essential. And we need some folks to assume that model of leadership that began with Du Bois in the Talented 10. And where are they today? Who will use their lives not to advance themselves, but use their lives and use their use of the levers of influence to lift up their people? That he calls the black intelligentsia, professional class persons, teachers, scholars, white-collar workers, preachers, as opposed to the Booker T. Washington model against which he rails, as did Du Bois, as sort of being content with what society will give you. This famous speech that Booker T. Washington gave in 1895 at the convention in Atlanta, in which he basically said, in all things that are purely economic, we can work together as one fist. In all things purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers. Essentially saying, we will concede political involvement for the sake of economic opportunity, even if that economic opportunity is at the bottom of the economic scale. And never really using his influence or his connections to the power brokers of the country who are supporting Tuskegee, but never getting them to support black people's higher aspirations. So that book, I think, everybody who has any influence over any other person ought to find their place in this black intelligentsia. It's a marvelous book. It's a collection of essays that Kilson wrote in his history at Harvard. Who is the preacher that everybody ought to hear?
Passed on historic, however.
Oh, well, God. I just fall in line with those who say that the greatest English-speaking preacher of the last 100 years was Gardner Taylor. I mean, I don't even have to think about that twice. The problem is that he's 96 and living in North Carolina in a nursing home, and he can't do it. But there are tapes and there are videos, and I don't think that you ought to go to heaven. In fact, you probably can't get in. That's an overstatement. You'll do better on the way if you hear him. I wish I could hear Mary G. Evans again. I don't know how to do that. I don't have any, she was before all of this technology stuff. But she's in the Daughters of Thunder. It all depends on your orientation, but if you really want to hear somebody who, as you say, sort of hybrids the prophetic and the pastoral, Charles Adams from Detroit is certainly a voice that needs to be heard. I grew up listening in New York City to the Trinity that was Gardner Taylor and Bill Jones and Samuel Proctor. They are all more readily available. And this Dr. Moss's father, just stunning. But in every one of these cases, you're not just listening to that person. This is the important thing. In every one of those cases, what you see standing up in them, all of those hands that helped to make them who they were. So that when you hear Gardner Taylor, you're hearing his father and grandfather. When you hear Sam Proctor, you're hearing all of this long legacy of black college presidents who were preachers, who were working so hard to fuse together the life of the mind and the life of the spirit. There's no other way to hear him except that way. And when you hear Bill Jones, you hear that rich Southern tradition from Kentucky, very much informed by literature and by rich imagination. And of course, his father and his grandfather as well. So, I mean, these are the ones who meant so much to me. But now, in the present generation, you just have to say what it is. I mean, listen, one of the ways to measure the extent to which the world honors a preacher is to ask who has been invited to give the Lyman Beecher lectures on preaching at Yale. Because there is a long line of people there going back to, I don't know, 1833 maybe? 1871, okay. Beginning with Henry Ward Beecher. And almost, I don't think Bill Jones gave those, but Samuel Proctor did, Gardner Taylor did. His father did, and he just did. Last month. Listen, don't take my word for it. Some things speak for themselves by virtue of the invitations that you give. My response to people who don't get invited is, don't be jealous. I'll tell one biblical story. The plane is a ways off, so I got no place to go for a while. There is, in the book of Acts, chapter 1, a story of the call of the successor to Judas, who was now dead by his own hand. And Peter gives this introduction in Acts 1 as to the criteria. Must have been with us from the time that Jesus was baptized by John. Must have been with us long enough to have been a witness to the resurrection. Okay, well, from the beginning to the end. And they found two people who were equally qualified, Justus and Matthias. Now, before I go any further, who here has ever heard a sermon on Matthias? The devil is Matthias. Matthias was the person that was selected to replace Judas before they went out 2 by 2. Can't go out 2 by 2 with 11. You need one more. Matthias was the person who rounded out the 12. Nobody's ever heard of Matthias. But when the roll call is given of who the disciples were, there'll be names that we all know. Peter, James, John, and names we've never even thought about. Bartholomew, Nathaniel, Matthias. Most preachers that I know yearn to be in the line of Peter, James, and John. I don't know any preacher who aspires to be Matthias. They want to be known. They want schools named after them, airports named after them, colleges named. Ain't no Matthias Hospital. Matthias, Minnesota. Just Matthias, just quietly doing what they all did, died the same death they all died, did the same work they all did. Somebody has to be the Peter, James, and John of their generation and carry that honor with humility. The Lord needs many more people like Matthias. Unknown, unheralded. But to quote Mother Teresa, never so much concerned about being successful as about being faithful. So, or as Dewey Smith said at Hampton earlier this year, if you stay in a small place long enough, God just might take you to a bigger place soon enough. But if you try to get to a big place too soon, you may end up in a small place sooner than you think. Because you weren't ready. Yeah, Lord, give me a big church in Chicago. Yeah, in time. Don't rush to it. You've got to get room for it.
Dr. McMickle, thank you so very much. And I think I speak for everybody that we have been blessed by the conversation today.
Well, thank you.
And I know you have a ride that's going to be picking you up.
Yes,
but I believe we
Sign
some books.
Yeah,
Sign some books before you leave. Okay.
And meet Pastor Hardy back there, yeah.
Hey, Pastor Hardy, how are you, sir?